Hi, thanks for joining me in my studio. I wanted to talk a little bit and give a video about materials. I get asked a lot of questions and thought this might be a little bit easier. This is very informal, so forgive some word salad and things I'm sure are going to come up. So I'll start with paints. I use, my preference for paints right now is Daniel Smith, M. Graham, and Winsor & Newton. Not because they're the only best paints, it's just that's who right now I like the consistency and the color options for the things that I'm looking for. There's no one right brand of paint. There are a lot of very good ones. Use the internet, do some research. If those aren't available where you live and you want to try something else, or if you already have other paints, you can look into it and find information as much as you want. Those are what I have because everybody always asks me. That doesn't mean that's what you have to have. One of the things you do want to watch for with paints, especially if you're going to be selling your work, is making sure that they are light fast and that they're a good permanent pigment that's not going to shift and change over time. And the way you find out about that is you check out the back of the tube, and it's pretty small print, but you'll see a light fastness rating on any decent brand of paint at least. And usually it's a 1, a 2, or a 3. You want to check with the manufacturer. The ones that I use, a 1 means it is the most light fast of the pigments, or it's in the category of most light fast, meaning it's not going to shift or change over time for you. Light fastness 2 might be small amounts of changes, usually tolerable. A level 3 I wouldn't use. Again, that's me personally. I'm selling my work. I want to guarantee that my clients have work that's going to stand the test of time and look good in 100 years or more. So all of my paints are light fastness 1 because I'm very careful about that. One popular pigment among artists is alizarin crimson, and I'm mentioning just because I know so many people who use alizarin crimson. It's a great color. I love it too, but it is a fugitive color. It changes over time. It turns a little brown. So if you want your red to stay red, you might look into some of the permanent alizarin crimson options, which are a different pigment, but they approximate the same color as alizarin crimson. And I've made the switch just because I want to guarantee that my work is gonna last. So the other thing that you'll get for information on the back of your tube of paint that's super important is the pigment. There is a number and letter series, I think usually 4, well no, there's 3 or 4 letters that are the pigment number. This is French ultramarine and happens to be pigment PB29. And the reason that's important is because one company's color with a particular name is not necessarily made out of the same pigments as another company's color using the same name, and they might look vastly different from each other. So if you want to know what color you're going to get, if you need to switch brands or anything else, that pigment number is really the key. So learning, and you don't need to know what they all mean. If you really want to, the internet is your friend. There is so much information that you can read about pigments. It's mind-boggling. It could become an entire area of expertise if that's really your thing. I just want paints that I know will work the way I want them to work. So I've done the research I need to understand how those are. I've experimented. I know what I like for now. It's always changing. Really is no one right way to paint. There really is no one right set of materials. Certainly no one right set of colors, except you want to learn how to use red, yellow, and blue to mix everything else, because that really is foundational to understanding how colors mix, how they work, how you're going to get the outcome that you're expecting to get. So many students of mine are frustrated because they feel like they get mud. They don't get the color they're looking for, and they don't understand why. Really, for me, it comes back to red, yellow, blue. If you understand how those work, and you understand how to mix the other colors you might put in your palette, then you can mix those other colors in ways that will be cleaner and fresher and have the look that you're actually wanting to get. If you don't understand how they work, when you start mixing different colors together that are already mixes of colors, lots of different stuff can happen, and it can be very hard to predict and very frustrating. So I have a lot of different colors in my palette besides just red, yellow, and blue. The bulk is red, yellow, and blue, but I do have some greens and I do have some browns. I use those. For me, they're a shortcut because I know how to make that color with my primary colors that I keep in my palette. If I didn't know how to make them, then they're a crutch, and then I'm really stuck on, I don't know how to make a green that I like, but I don't really love what's in the tubes. Now what do? Learn your red, yellow, and blue. So the key to red, yellow, and blue is you want 2 sets. You want a red, yellow, and blue that lean warm, and you want a red, yellow, and blue that lean cool. What does that mean? So if you remember, maybe when you were young, or maybe more recently, you learned about the color wheel. We have our primaries, red, yellow, blue, and from them we can mix the secondaries. So red and yellow makes orange, yellow, blue makes green, red and blue makes violet. Hopefully that's familiar. If we divide this color wheel in half, these are what we think of as the warm colors, red, orange, and yellow, because they remind us of warm things like, say, fire. I know there's other colors in fire. There's blues in fire, there's other things, but generally those colors we consider warm. Generally we consider these colors cool, green, blue, and violet. And those are colors that maybe are reminiscent of shadows or ocean waves or things that we associate with cool things. I don't know who came up with this concept, but this is the concept. So if you're thinking of warm and cool, or if you understand warm and cool, when we take red and look at the other side of the color wheel, we get green, blue to orange, and yellow to violet. These opposites are called complementary colors. Maybe this is familiar. What happens when you mix complementary colors? You get some kind of a neutral. Ideally a gray, but some, depending on what your actual colors are, sometimes it's more like brown. Why? That's because when we're mixing complements, we're mixing one of the primaries with a secondary that's made with the other two primaries. So when we mix complements, we're actually mixing all three primaries together. And when you mix all three primaries together, you get gray, you get neutral. So if I'm trying to mix a green that I want very bright and very fresh, and I'm using a yellow and a blue to get to my green, if my yellow and blue are a warmer version of yellow and blue, and I'll explain this in a minute, I'm going to end up with a more earthy or more muted, more neutralized, grayed down green, and not the bright fresh green I was expecting to get because I'm using yellow and blue. So warm versus cool. The yellows are pretty easy to see. There's differences in the reds and blues too. I hope you can make that out. When we think about warm and cool, red is a warm color. So both of these reds are warm colors, but they lean different directions. So if you remember that reds, it's between orange and violet. This is my warm red, it leans more towards orange. This is my cool red, it leans more towards violet. And I get down to my yellows and same thing. This one, yellow, remember, is between orange and green. This yellow leans more towards orange. That one's fairly easy to see. Yellows for me are probably the color where I most utilize the vast difference in color temperature in them. So this is my warm, and I use a very warm yellow. It really is almost an orange, but still yellow. And then this is my cool yellow, which is leaning distinctly towards green. It's the coolest yellow I can find that has a light fastness rating of 1, and it's taken me a long time to get there. Blues are a little trickier because if you remember, blue is sitting right in the middle of the cool half of the color wheel. So how on earth do you know whether it leans warm or cool when both of the colors it leans towards are going to be technically cool colors? Well, my eye tells me that this feels warmer, this feels cooler. But the way I know that that's how my pigments are actually indeed working is when I mix them. So if I stay on the cool side and I mix a yellow and a blue that are cool, I'm going to get a very vivid green. Like picture a leaf with the sunlight coming in behind it and it's just really vibrant green. I can get that if I use this yellow with this blue. And that is such a bright color, it has such a high chroma to it. There is no neutral coming into play. So this has to be a cool blue that I'm mixing with my cool yellow, or I could not get that color. If I use this blue and mix it with my cool yellow, what I get is a much more earthy looking green. Not super earthy, but more muted, toned down, something you might actually see in nature in average circumstances, not with the bright sunlight right behind it. And if I use my warm yellow with my warm blue, I get very earthy greens, like maybe pine forest kinds of colors. So this is my warm blue and this is my cool blue. I will tell you the ones that I personally am using on my palette right now, but they change. There's no one right answer. I would encourage you to not just go buy new paints if you're figuring this out with me. Use what you have and do color samples like this. Try to get your value, the lightness or darkness of your paint mix right in the middle, so it's not too dark and it's not too light. You can actually see the main color that you're getting with each of your paints, and paint them out and take a look at them. You might find that all of your yellows are right in the middle, or that they all lean middle to warm, or cool to middle, or something like that. You really want to have this variety, because then we can pull to extremes when we go to mixing our colors. Now, one caveat with that, with using red, yellow, blue, is if you do florals, my reds here are never going to be able to get me that vivid fuchsia, or like a rich kind of very clean, bright pink or purple color. You really have to buy the pigments that can get you there. You might still mix them with these paints, but this is as bright as we're really going to get out of the tube with any of these paints. So you might need some specialty colors depending on what your subject matter is, and that's okay. But I would still suggest that we learn with this and just get as close as we can. You can get fairly close. It just won't have all the impact you might be hoping for. Now, the other pigment that I will often add in for students is something really dark, so you have an easy time getting really dark values. I don't like black. Black feels very heavy. I usually mix my darks from my reds, yellows, and blues. I keep some very, very deep blues, and mixing those with my reds produces pretty dark colors. Sometimes it's not enough, and I will pull into something else. Right now I enjoy neutral tint for that. It blends with any color very cleanly. It doesn't make it muddy or unattractive. It's a really nice color. And then also on my palette, I pretty much always have burnt umber, just because I really like the combination of burnt umber and French ultramarine for grays. You can very easily lean towards warm with a little more brown, towards cool with a little more blue, or very neutral. It's just a great color combination for getting some nice neutral gray colors. So I really like those. That's what I have on my palette right now. But again, you do not need to use the same colors that I use. For the record, because everybody wants to know, my warm red is a quinacridone red. My cool red is that permanent alizarin crimson. My warm yellow is gamboge. My cool yellow is very specific. It's the Daniel Smith brand lemon yellow. Most companies' lemon yellow is an opaque pigment. Daniel Smith is not. It's a transparent, fully transparent, beautiful, very clean, very cool yellow, and it is the only pigment I found for the experimenting I've had time to do so far that I actually really like for my cool yellow. It has that light fastness rating of 1, and so many of them don't. And then my warm blue is French ultramarine. My cool blue is often phthalocyanide blue. That's a very staining color, and sometimes it's really not right. Sometimes I'll use a cerulean blue. Cerulean blues vary widely. Some are warmer, some are cooler. So if you just buy cerulean, it might be a warmer color. You might need to experiment and play with different companies or different mixes to find the right cerulean if that's something that you go to use. And like I said, burnt umber and neutral tint. So that's the basics with pigment and color, and that's a lot. Now, the other complexity in here, which we won't get into too much, is that color has value. This is a value chart. Value is how light or dark something is. This is a 10 value chart going from 1 to 10, paper, to as dark as I could get with my neutral tint, everything in between. I often have students make these because this can be a resource you use to compare to your reference and compare to your painting to see if you're where you think you are. We learn color and labeling color when we're really little. Culturally, it's just what we do. Nobody really explains to us value. We don't grow up thinking about value as a thing to notice. And yet we do notice. Our brains register value before color. You look at a black and white photograph, it looks exactly realistic. It's just missing the color. It's those values that really define the mood and the feeling and everything about what you're looking at. So if your values are off, you probably won't be happy with your outcome, and you might not understand why, and you might be trying to fix it with color. And yes, our pigments have color, and so it is color, but it's the value of the color. So if you look at my palette, maybe you can tell that some things look lighter than others. Generally, yellows are the lightest pigment out of the tube, and the darkest is going to be in a violet range. And then you can look through here, my blues are probably the next darkest thing, then maybe my reds and browns, then maybe my greens, then my oranges, and then my yellows are the lightest. So it's important to remember that you cannot get darker with a pigment than the way it comes out of the tube. So that bright yellow might be, if we compare this and you squint, I think we're looking at a 2 or a 3 value for this yellow. I probably can't get darker than a 3 or maybe 4 with this particular pigment. So if I'm sure that this is the color that I'm looking at, but it seems darker, I need to rethink if this is actually the color I'm looking at, because I'm probably not. There's probably some brown or something else in there that's making it darker. My brain is just telling me, oh, that's yellow, because we learn how to identify colors in these categories of red, orange, yellow, green, blue, purple, when there's so much more nuance to what's going on. And the value is really, really, really key. So it's great exercise to start out when you're first learning to paint and learning how your materials work. Don't try to do everything all at once. Try to simplify what your purpose is with a given painting. So maybe do some things that are monochromatic, meaning pick one pigment and do the whole painting with one pigment. I've done a number of things where I've used trees and done like indigo or neutral tint, just an attractive color that can get really dark, but then I do it all just as if it's black and white, only it does have a color to it, and it's interesting to look at. There's lots of great stuff you could do with just black and white. I could paint for the rest of my life with only black paint and probably have a great time and do all kinds of things I really love. It's just, the values are just so key. I cannot emphasize that enough. Values are so much more important than color. Value carries the color. Color gets all of the glory, but really the value is doing the work. The color is just kind of the pretty surface of it. I do care about color, and I do spend a lot of time on color, and I do talk about and teach color mixing, all of that. But if you don't know how to see value accurately, you want to work on this. Easiest way to do that is take your reference material, find a simple subject, make your photograph black and white, print it black and white, and paint it in black and white. Do that a few times. Paint really simple things, like just a plain tree, or trees in the fog maybe, because that can be just light and dark. If you're not going to sell your work, you can pull images off the internet for personal, private use that you never show anyone, just as an exercise. That's probably okay if you don't have images of your own or an old calendar or something like that, but make it black and white. And then you're copying what you actually see and learning how to see what's happening with those values. Then your next step would be to do that, but have your color photograph there too. So you're really looking at how is the color and value happening between these. You can move on to color reference material and then use a value chart like this, make one of these or make 10 of them, and hold it up to your reference material and then squint. If you squint, it's a little bit easier for your brain to turn off the excitement of the color and look at what's happening. So if I come into, say, actually this will be easier. Let's look at maybe the table surface, or maybe my sponge is good. Actually, this might not read very well. That might be too dark to see on there. Okay, we'll go back to this. If I take my blue here, I could guess, oh, it's probably going to be here. Oh, that looks really dark. I'm going to be down here. Well, if I squint at it, that's probably too dark. Maybe it's here, but maybe it's somewhere in here. Probably this. So it's probably a 7 on my 1 to 10 value scale. Get good at doing that. Practice it. Take a look around your environment and think about what's the value of all this stuff. If you're doing something that's boring, you have endless things to learn and teach yourself just by observing what's around you and trying to think about value and relative value. Are whites actually white? Almost never. What's the value happening in something that we think of as white, like snow? Snow, sure, it's white, but if you actually look at a landscape covered in snow, there's some areas that are highlighted and probably close to an actual paper white, but most of it has some amount of value to it, just very soft and nuanced maybe. Same with an awful lot of subjects. So just getting your brain working on thinking about values is so helpful, so helpful. And if something's going wrong in your painting, it just feels off, it's a really good chance the value is what's behind what's off. Take a photograph of what you're working on, make the photograph of your painting black and white, make your photo or your reference, or if you're looking in life, take a photo of your life reference and make that black and white. Compare your painting and compare your reference, both in black and white, and see where your values are varying. Just as an educational thing. They don't have to match. You can make choices to have them not match, but I'd rather you make that a conscious choice and not an accidental thing that just sort of happened. Sometimes it might work out, sometimes you might be really dissatisfied with it. So again, cannot stress the importance of values enough. It really is your best friend. Let's see, so we've got paints, value and color. Let's look at brushes. Well, let's talk about paper first. Paints and brushes, There are good options that are very economical. They might not be the most light fast or the very nicest, whatever, but they will work just fine. There's plenty of inexpensive paints and brushes that I could deal with painting with and be just as happy. Okay, maybe not just as happy, but it'd be a subtle difference. But paper is your big difference. If you can afford to spend a little money somewhere, spend it on your paper. What you're looking for is a 100% cotton rag, not cellulose. And you can find some more economical versions of watercolor paper that are made with cotton rag. They do exist out there. Last I was looking, Winsor & Newton had I've used their 300-pound professional grade. It's a cotton rag, but pretty affordable. And then Cheap Joe's Art Supplies makes their own brand called Kilimanjaro. And that is a pretty nice paper. I've used it before, and I've used it a lot in teaching. It's 100% cotton rag. This is a pad, so paper comes lots of different ways. This is a pad, you just rip off a sheet and use it. They also make sheets. You can buy large sheets and cut them to whatever size you want. Certain brands make rolls. I have a 55-inch by 10-yard roll of one of the papers I use a lot because I can get really large pieces or very small pieces. And then you can also get blocks. So a block of paper has glued edges on all sides with one gap that's not glued. So when you're done with your painting on top, you work your fingernail or a gentle tool around the outside edge to break the glue for that top sheet of paper and peel it off. And what I like about blocks, I don't use them a lot, but I'll use them smaller when traveling or maybe painting plein air or something like that, because it's sort of half stretched, it's contained, it's ready to go, it's easy, just open it up and it already offers you a firm surface to work on. I mentioned that I think of it as half stretched. What I mean by that is there's a technique you can do with your paper to make it not wrinkle and bubble as you're painting on it, and that's called stretching. So the way you stretch paper, and I've got some ready here that I prepared for my next painting. You take a firm surface, and currently I'm using a dense foam board that takes staples really nicely. And what you're gonna do, the way stretching works, is if you saturate the paper, if every last fiber in your paper is completely saturated, they're all expanded as far as they're ever going to expand. And if you then tack down the edges while it's fully saturated and expanded, when it dries, it pulls in on those edges, but it's held firm. So when you go to paint, you can completely saturate your paper again, but it will be flat. It won't bubble because it's already been held in place at that most expanded size. I hope that makes sense. So you take your piece of paper, and I will run it. I've got two different methods. If I'm at home, I'll use a bathtub and run it under the faucet to get both sides nice and saturated. Then I set it on my board, set a timer. At my studio here, I don't have a bathtub, so I have a big tray that I use only for stretching paper, so it's very clean. And I will fill a couple inches of water in there, and then I can run my paper through both sides. I don't soak it. I want to keep the sizing in my paper, but I do run it through like that. To get it wet. And then I set it on my board, and I set a timer for a few minutes, and I check on it. And depending on the weather, depending on the humidity, it might take 10 minutes or so to stretch my paper, but it's gonna vary based on the air where you're living and when you're doing this. So I'm checking on every few minutes to make sure the paper stays wet and doesn't start to dry out. So we'll re-wet both sides. You can use a spray bottle, just make sure you're flipping it and you get it sprayed down on both sides. And you're watching. It'll get some ripples. There might be a few bubbles. If you keep it saturated and you wait, it will fully flatten out. And when it's fully flattened out, then you want to place it on your board where you want it. You make sure it's the right side up so that you're painting on the side you want to paint on. And then I use staples. There's tapes and things made too. I prefer staples because they come out very cleanly. And you can't see them because I cover them with tape. But I have stapled my paper to the edge. I come in maybe 1/3 of an inch to make sure it's not going to rip. The tension of that paper, if it's a bigger sheet of paper, I have to bring my staples in further because the tension that paper can pull on those staples can end up ripping the paper sometimes. So I'm careful about that. And you want them pretty close together so there's not room for warps and wriggles in between your staples. And then you just let it dry. I set it up on an angle, let it drip, let all the water drip off, and then let it dry. Usually takes a half day. Sometimes it might take most of the day, depending on how humid it is. And then I like to use masking tape. I like to square my edges carefully so when I go to mat my painting, I know it's going to be matted where I expect it to be matted. and that I'm not having to trim off something I actually cared about. And I love the tape because I like clean, nice things, and when you're done, you get to pull the tape off and you have this clean, beautiful edge that's framing your work, and that's just kind of delightful. I enjoy that. So paper comes with different surfaces. The three standard ones are hot press, cold press, and rough. Hot press is very smooth surface, and cold press is kind of in the middle, and rough is very textured. So depending on how you work, one of these might be a better fit than the other, and I can't tell you for sure. You have to experiment and see how your style of painting works on the paper and what you like, because it's not the same for any two people necessarily. So those are the main three options. Fabriano also makes one called a soft press that's sort of, it's a cold press, but it has a little less texture to it. So someone who works very detailed might like that because there's less divots for your shapes to get bumped by. I often paint on arches. Fabriano is another good brand that I would use. There's a lot of good brands. If you do some research, look for that 100% cotton rag. You can easily look online if you have other brands that you're curious about, read what other people say about them. A lot of the suppliers will have reviews for different products, and you can read what other people do and don't like and maybe find something that's a good fit for you that way. If I don't know you personally and don't know your work really, really well, I probably should not be giving you any recommendations as far as how I think you're going to want to work, because it's just really so personal. And that's the same with brushes. So I have a whole bunch of different brushes here. I have so many more. I'm trying to make myself experiment more. I get into the habit of, this works for me, and I'm just going to use the thing that works for me, when I know there's probably things that work better. So I'm trying to make myself try more. But again, you can be very economical with brushes. If you want to be really economical, there's two brands I would recommend. Dick Blick Art Supplies sells a golden Taklon, their own brand. I think it's Blick Scholastic. It's a blue handle, and it's a golden Taklon brush, and they have nice round ones with this beautiful, fine, clean tip point, and they hold up really well. I've used them with young kids, and they've held that point for a year or two, which is amazing. And they're $3 or $4, maybe they're $5 now. And another brand that's good is Simply Simmons. Very similar, pretty good point. They have more of a range of shapes and styles. They've got some flat brushes and other things too, but also in the $5-ish range for a brush, which is very economical. So if you're limited on what you can afford to spend on your materials, put more money into paper, look for those more economical options with the brushes that you paint. So with brushes, the things I most often end up using are a mid-range round, something around that size, a smaller round, which gets used less, but it does get used. And then I also like my 1-inch flat for all kinds of things. You can paint on just the corner and get a lot of detail. I've done portraits where this is the only brush I've used. I really love this. It's a workhorse. It can do all of the things really well. And it's a great way if I'm painting something where I was very detailed in one area and I need to be more abstracted in another area. This can help me not want to fall into the habit, because I can choose a way of using my brush that means I can't paint in that other more detailed way. So for me, that's a nice tool for that too. There's lots of brands that I like, and I have a whole array. The price can vary a lot, and the way they work varies a little bit too. So one of the ones that I've liked for a long time is the Richardson Professional series. This is their Steve Quiller line within the series, and it's just a nice round, very nice fine tip to that brush. Good sized body, so it's a whole lot of paint and also get fine details. Has a nice snap when you're working with it. It's a very crisp feel, which is usually what I like. The Escoda, this is the Perla line. They too have that nice, crisp, responsive feel to them. But I also like the Silver Black Velvet, also very nice fine point. It has a softer, more give to it than these others, which sometimes I love, sometimes I hate. It depends on what I'm painting. This makes more kind of like calligraphic. You can do kind of calligraphy shapes very easy with this brush, just the way it lays and the shapes that you can make with it. So it's very neat for depending on what you're painting. Sometimes this has been the perfect thing, especially for some leaves for me. I'll do whole paintings with this. Other times I'll do whole paintings with the other. Sometimes I mix. It's just varies on my mood and what feels like it's going to be the right tool. And then for my smaller brushes, I've really gotten into this particular one. It's called a long round by Princeton, and it's just longer than your standard tiny brush, which means that the body can hold more paint. So if I'm doing fine lines, I can paint a lot longer before I have to go reload my brush, and I really like that. I'm experimenting with one of the larger ones to see if I like it larger, or if I only like it really as a small. And then I brought just a few of these to share. I have, like I said, so many different things. I have some mop brushes. These are very soft, which means you get a very soft application of paint versus if I was going to drop in a sky, if I pre-wet my paper, even if I pre-wet my paper and I'm bringing my lines of color in to get a nice gradient, I might see some edges or some lines come across because these bristles are stiff enough that they're going to push that pigment around. Where this is so soft that I probably won't get that. So I'll use this a lot for large paintings with a dark to light sky effect. And then I have some smaller, different styles of mop. This one is just super, super soft. And sometimes to get the look I want in a subject, I will paint a certain way and then I'll come back with a glaze or two over just because it shifts how the shapes mix with each other. It just gives the look that I want. And a really soft brush like this is great for that because it won't disturb the edges. If you use a brush with more snap, it's going to push pigment around a little bit more than something that's really, really soft. And for that, one of the lines that I've really grown to love, I hated them at first, but the Princeton Neptune, which is a synthetic swirl, I've really liked because it's very, very soft, but it comes in the shapes that I'm used to with the rounds. It has a point when it's wet, it has a nice point, so I can use it very soft. So I don't like it for some things, but I love it for other things, just depending on what I'm painting. So it's worth experimenting, but boy, can you very quickly drop a lot of money on brushes, and it's not necessary. If you just had a nice flat, a medium round, a small round, most of my paintings are done with these 3 brushes. Or could be. If not, honestly, just one of these. One of the medium rounds. So, lots of options. Other things that I often have on hand, I keep artist tape around so I can tape the edges when I stretch paper. I do keep masking fluid around. I don't always use it. I do a lot of paintings with no masking at all, and I do some paintings with a little bit of masking, and I do some paintings with a lot of masking. It just depends on what the subject is and what approach feels like it will get me closer to the mood and the feel and the outcome that I'm after. Sometimes masking fluid is just the right thing. My favorite right now is, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing this right, Pebeo, P-E-B-E-O. They have the standard liquid that you apply with a brush. One trick with that is it will gum up your brush. So have a little container of soapy water and have a tiny little container that you can put just a little bit of your masking fluid into. And then run your brush through the soapy water first. Take off the extra water, your sponge is fine for that. And then go to the masking fluid. That little bit of soap on the brush bristles helps keep the masking fluid from sticking to them. Every couple of minutes you'll probably have to clean off your brush and go back into the soap again to recoat those bristles. I tend to just use older brushes and the soap. Otherwise, one use and it's kind of unusable again. For fine details, they also make this pen, which is kind of nifty. It has a tip on it that when you press down, it starts to flow, and then the masking fluid flows, and you can get fairly small shapes with that. The trick with masking fluids are several things. One, you don't want to leave it on your paper more than a few days. It will eventually start to bond to the paper and you won't be able to get it off. If you're doing shapes with masking fluid and you want soft edges, you're in for a lot of work because you get very hard edges with masking fluid. The paper is either blocked off or it's not. And the edge where those two areas meet is going to look differently depending on how you paint it. If you paint very fluidly with a lot of paint and water, that puddle that's on your paper as it soaks in and dries is going to let pigment pool towards your masking fluid edge, and you might get a hard edge of even darker pigment before you go to the white of the paper. That might be the perfect look for some things, but it might be really frustrating for other things. If you mask your clouds and paint your sky and expect it to be this smooth, perfect gradient with these clouds sticking out, you might be really disappointed and find that you have a dark blue outline around your clouds because your paint was pooling because you were working a little bit too wet for using masking fluid. So often when I do use masking fluid, I end up spending a lot of time softening edges. I will choose to use more easily lifting paints and pigments, things that aren't as staining the paper so that they will lift and move. And I will take a small brush and I can kind of finesse or wiggle that edge gently with some water to just soften and make a soft value transition, a gradual value transition from my the rest of what I painted into my masked off area. You can also come in with a fine point brush and paint inside the masked area to create whatever value shift or color shift you need in there. So just know that you'll get very crisp hard edges if you use masking fluid. It's definitely not the right thing for everything. And when you go to take it off, you can use your finger and rub. Sometimes that can make your fingers really sore. They make little tools that are mask removers. You just kind of rub and it peels it off. If you are like me and you paint fairly dark and fairly, I guess just dark and in layers, it can be really tough to get down to the masking because you'll have layers of paint on top of it that you're having to rub off before the masking is lifting. That's just how it is with some things, which is another reason why masking is not always the thing I want to do. Sometimes it is actually easier to paint around the tiny little lighter shapes than it is to mask and then have to deal with all the things around that. That's our basics. I don't know if I mentioned the sponge. In case I didn't, this is like the tool to save you for water control. So paper towels or anything else, if you saturate your sponge and wring it out all the way, you can repeat that over and over again. If you have your jar of water and you saturate your brush in there, really swish it around good, you can repeat that over and over again. From a saturated brush, you can take off small amounts of water at a time on the sponge. It won't just soak lots in really fast. You can be really delicate with how much you take off. And so you could get just the drip off your brush and have a very fluid application on your paper, or you could take a whole lot off and end up with a very dry brush application on your paper. You've got all of the possibilities in the world using a sponge, and you have the control to learn how to know what you have without having to think about it. And after, I don't know, probably was a good 3 to 5 years for me of always painting with a sponge to I never have to think about it. I know exactly what I'm going to get when I go to my paper because I've been doing it the same way long enough that I now have learned exactly what to expect, and I know what that is. That said, different brushes are going to act differently because different brushes hold different amounts of water. So depending on how many times you put it down, it will be different brush to brush. But if you use mostly the same kinds of brushes most of the time, you'll figure it out. It's not a big deal. I think that's the basics, and hopefully that is useful to you as you embark on figuring out your materials, whether you're new to this or not. There are a lot of materials out there, and there might be something that works better for you. Don't necessarily use the thing that somebody else uses just because they use it, just because they're a good painter, just because. Find out how that paper works. Think about the way you like to paint, the way your paintings tend to come out, and what makes sense. A good quality, middle of the road professional paper really is the Arches. It is a workhorse. I use it all the time. Oh, I forgot one thing with paper. I talked about the different surfaces, the hot press, cold press, rough. I did not talk about the different weights. So paper is labeled, the thickness of your paper goes by the weight of a certain quantity. I forget what it is. So it's measured in grams or in pounds. The standard, I guess you would call it that, standard Arches, most watercolor paper is going to come in 140 pound or 300 pound. 140 pound is flexible. It stretches beautifully. This is what I use for almost everything I paint, no matter how big it is. It stretches beautifully. It's very flexible. 300 pound, 140 to 300, that's a significant difference. It's more than twice as thick. There's my movement on that. It's more like a cardboard almost even. It's so thick and dense. Some people paint on 300 and don't stretch at all and have good luck. I've had 300 paper warp on me. So I have stretched 300 pound paper. I often just use the 140 at this point. I do have 300 around. If I'm painting small, it's great because smaller paintings, you probably won't have to stretch, depends on how you paint. But I'm not a super wet painter. So if I stay smaller, 300 pound might be really great if I'm traveling or doing a teaching demo or something like that. So it varies. They all work a little different. They hold the paint differently. They'll give you a little bit of a different outcome. So it really is a matter of experimentation and finding what works for you. solid place to start is that materials list that's on my website. The standard red, yellow, blue, a nice standard middle road paper, a cold press 140 pound is a great place to start. And like I said, just if even just a couple brushes, just this guy or this one or all three of these is a great starting place. Down the road, you can consider gradually adding others, or if you have all sorts of gift certificates for art supply stores and a budget to burn, then sure, buy all of the things and experiment with all of them. Or maybe you have friends and you can trade brushes around and play with different things to see how they work for you. So happy exploring, happy painting, and I hope to see you in a lesson soon.